Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel on Poets Crossing Genre. So great to see a wonderful crowd on a beautiful, beautiful Sunday afternoon. When I was saying that when I parked my car, it seemed like everyone had gone up into the rapture. I mean, parking everywhere. And I thought, well, okay, I could hear a pin drop and everybody decided to go to the river today or to take a walk on the trails or something. But thank you for coming inside to think about, care about books. Very much appreciate it. As always, I want to start out, as we always do, thanking the Virginia Festival of the Book folks, a fleet of devoted employees and also volunteers who make all of this happen, this magic happen. Next year will be the 30th year of the festival, and that it's one of our town's gifts, I think. And so thank you for helping to keep it going and supporting it. And I also want to thank the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, which sponsors the Virginia Festival of the Book. And so if you are inclined to support writers and their books, which I think you are because you're here, there are books for sale on the back, so that's one way to do it. Any of us would be happy to sign, but also consider donating to the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. And if you'd like to direct that gift to the Virginia Festival of the Book, that would be terrific. So thank you. And I want to also just, there are a lot of, this is the last day of the festival, there are a lot of riches to come, but I wanted to single out in particular a reading at 6 p.m. at Visible Records by alumni of the Creative Writing Program at the University of Virginia. And the amazing Samantha Thornhill and Celeste Lipkis will be reading at 6 at Visible Records, which is down in the Woolen Mills. If you haven't been there, it's a treasure also. Okay, so today there are bios in the literature, and I don't want to spend a lot of time repeating what you've already read, but I just wanted to introduce my fellow panelists. This is Quan Barry here and Thorpe Moeckel, and as I said, I'm Lisa Russ Spaar. And even though we're here to talk about how maybe on most days we identify principally as being poets, everybody on this panel has nimbly crossed genres for quite a long time. And so maybe part of our conversation can be, what is it about a particular subject or bit of material that calls for someone who works primarily or often in one mode to work in another. And that may come up quite naturally as we speak. I think Quan may be one of the few people I know who's actually won the very prestigious and competitive National Endowment for the Arts Awards, both in fiction and poetry. And the book that we're here to celebrate today, When I'm Gone From You, Look in the East, a novel that is her third novel, not her first, differs though quite significantly in many exciting ways from novels that Quan has written before. Quan is also, in addition to being a poet and a fiction writer, a playwright. And then Thorpe is fluent in what I like to think of as river. He knows this area, and especially our region and the Appalachian region, about it as well as anybody I know, except for maybe Jonathan Cannon, who's in the audience, and has written not only beautiful books about the natural world, but also gorgeous essays and autofiction essays about the natural world. So already working in other genres than poetry, and then we're here today to celebrate True as True Can Be, his first middle grade novel. So that's exciting. And then I am, I do identify mostly as a poet, but I've also for years anthologized and edited collections. It's the agoraphobic part of me who wants to get a lot of parties, is interested in anthologizing, just bringing together different voices and seeing what happens when they come together. And I've also written a collection of essays about contemporary American poetry, and then just this past half year ago, my first novel, Paradise Close. So I think this is where we like to go. When I go to bed, I want to know how long I'm going to have to sit and so forth. This event runs until 3, and so we thought we might each take about 10 minutes to read from our work, because we were asked by the festival, and I was grateful for this chance to consider this not just talking about our stuff, but also reading from it. And we'll do that about 10 minutes a piece, then maybe converse a little bit with one another, and then open up to questions from the audience if you have any. And I want to remind you again that there are books for sale on the back, and please consider supporting books by buying one. or 2 or 3. Okay, so I think we're going to go in alphabetical order, so I think Quan will start us off. Yeah. Hold it for me if you want to. Fabulous. So is there a way to also have a stand? That's what I was saying. I'm not, I have like an iPad and I'm like, oh, I don't know if I have enough hands to, it also makes me feel a little bit like a lounge singer. Is this on? This one? All right. Fabulous. Can you all hear me? Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for coming out. One of my former professors is here as well, and I know that as a professor, like your free time is precious to you, so it means a lot to me, Deborah, that you're here. So thank you very much. You are literally one of the reasons why I'm here. As an undergraduate, I studied with her, and I feel very fortunate that she's here in the room with us today. So thank you. I would also, just in saying my thank yous, again, obviously I want to thank you all for coming out. And I also, as was mentioned, I'm also a playwright, so I want to put on my hat. I know I'm preaching a little bit to the choir here, but about attending events in person. Obviously, in many ways it's been a hard few years for many of us in the book industry, but in many ways the pandemic was good for us because our primary relationship with you is a private one. It's us in your homes as you spend your time reading our works. And for us, again, we managed to thrive in many ways during that particular time. But for many other of the performing arts, for example, theater, opera, symphony, all those kinds of things, they really need you to come back out to those kinds of things in person. I'm seeing it firsthand again in the theater world. So if you're at all inclined and you're thinking about picking up a second art that you support, think about whatever local performance space that you might support in that way, and do consider doing that. So thank you. Today I'm just going to read 2 pieces. I'm not sure I'm going to go the full 10 minutes. But as was mentioned, I'm both a poet and also a novelist, and now kind of a new playwright as well. And so I'm going to read one slightly longer poem. It's called Auction, and I actually wrote it at Saratoga Springs at a colony called Yaddo, which some of you may know. As you also may know, that like Charlottesville, Saratoga Springs is horse country. And so this is about an experience that I had in Saratoga Springs. And the poem is called Auction. Auction. What was I wearing? I don't recall. I remember walking down a series of switchbacks away from the Italianate mansion where all of her children died. Night was inching over the world horizontally from right to left, the moon's structured whiteness and objet d'art. Then we arrived at the beautiful space filled with beautiful gold-flecked people. Everywhere strings of light, illuminated filigree, a world webbed with stars, the feeling of bodily effervescing. No, I hadn't been to the track. I had heard that was where squalor lived, a barely contained seediness that was allowed. I am one who has been reared to prefer the cultivated, even the men trailing with bush brooms in tuxedos as they sweep up the bready droppings that break apart so easily, loosing their fragrance of grass and earth. Why should this veneer fail me now? Watching the crowd lean forward, smelling their hunger, the sound of the gavel falling like a cudgel on a head, and the good people rushing forward to shake the hand of the victorious. I saw our history in it, roped right there in the ring. The muscled beauty of excellence, the monocular acuity, how the breadth of the eye evolved for speed. It stood on the dais as the groom lovingly turned its best side to the light, its best side being every side, coat gleaming like blackest water. The whole room instantly aroused, the men's pants tenting, the women with their sudden secretions as happens when you are in the presence of the holiest of forms. It was looking at us with an awareness beyond time, casting its 50-foot parabolic gaze broadly over the earth. Admittedly, as my mind filled with images of heated brands and whips, I thought of Christ last, the petals of blood licking his face. It was every being who has ever stood center stage in chains, all of us implicated simply by being there, regardless of sympathy or intent. Ecce homo. Then I heard a voice shout 2.2 and another go higher. The most pragmatic teaching Jesus ever gave, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's.
the gavel finally falling on 2.8 million. But what if we don't know the difference? No, it wasn't just my presence that made me a participant to spectacle, which explains why I've carried this haunting ever since. He said the poor will be with us always, and I ran with it. I let me off the hook. Then the groom, tuxedo dark as ink, himself descended from such brutality, turned and let it out. So to tell you a little bit about my novel, When I'm Gone, Look for Me in the East, as was mentioned, this is my third book. All of my books are very different. My first novel was set in Vietnam, and I think of it kind of as an Eastern ghost story in certain kinds of ways. My second novel, We Ride Upon Sticks, is a comedy about a high school field hockey team that uses witchcraft to try and make it to the state championship. And then suddenly I wrote this book, which is it's about a young Tibetan Buddhist monk living in Mongolia who is Mongolian, and he's basically charged with going out into the vast Mongolian countryside to look for reincarnation. And so the story begins, we see him as he's, again, starting this particular journey. I'll just tell you a little bit about the genesis of the novel. So I'm somebody, I've been very fortunate in my career as an academic to be able to travel to many different places. When I go somewhere, I most times do not know what I'm going to do with my travels, how I'm going to research it, and stories and ideas come to me after I've been somewhere. So for example, I was in Mongolia in 2008, and I didn't decide to write about it until maybe 2013. Similarly, I was actually very fortunate to be in Antarctica in 2004, and I'm actually writing a book now that's set in Antarctica. So again, I usually just go someplace, I'm basically a tourist, I'm just looking around, observing things, and then like I said, years later, stories come to me. And I am a donator to NPR, because most of my story ideas come from NPR. So I think I have to give them a cut, right? And so one year, many years ago, roughly around 2000, I don't remember when he was saying this exactly, but basically the Dalai Lama, because he fears that when he dies, the Chinese government will politicize his death and name a new Dalai Lama who will essentially be a puppet. At the time, the Dalai Lama was saying that what he would do in order to avoid that is that he was thinking about taking the unprecedented step of reincarnating while he was still alive, so that way he could obviously control the narrative, right? He no longer says that, he has other plans in place. But at the time when I heard that story, I literally just was like, my head just exploded, and I thought, what? And then I began to go down a rabbit hole of thinking about reincarnations in general and just what a fascinating story that is. And again, primarily it's only the Tibetan Buddhists who go looking for reincarnations, the Theravadas don't do that, et cetera, et cetera. And so I realized that when I was thinking about the story and doing research for it, that the perfect place for me to set it would actually be Mongolia. The phrase Dalai Lama is actually, Dalai is a Mongolian word meaning ocean. Lama is the Tibetan word for teacher. And so there's many ways in which these two cultures have been sharing traditions, religions through the ages. And so they're very close when it comes to the kind of Buddhism that's practiced there. And so I decided ultimately to set my story in that place. So again, I'm just going to read for the very first. The book is written entirely in present tense, which I do say a little bit with a little bit of pride because it was hard to do. So when I say that the book is set entirely in present tense, I mean it's set entirely. There's no past tense, even when there's flashbacks. The way the entire book is written is that it's in present tense. So the one time when you won't hear it in this section, but I do on a couple of occasions use the future tense we. So there's kind of a mantra that is woven through the book. When the only hope is a boat and there is no boat, I will be the boat. So it's true that that's obviously future tense. But by and large, the entire book is written in present tense, which in many ways obviously complements, Buddhist ideas about living in the present, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the beginning of my book, When I'm Gone, Look for Me in the East. Listen without distraction. Outside the post office in Boort, a handful of men clump around a pool table, its felt top sun-ravaged and mangy, the men's faces weathered from living in a world without trees. When I step outside, they stare, each man a finger and a fist, and the one slumped in the ratty camping chair at the head of the table is the thumb. I glance at the digital watch the Rinpoche hands me last night, its plastic band already cracked, the thing used. I know it is a necessity, that I must have it for the places I am to journey to in my search that must not fail. Nevertheless, I feel like one of the wild horses foreign researchers shoot down with arrow guns, the animal succumbing so that the researcher can fix the radio collar around its neck, the collar eventually becoming a part of the body. After just a few hours in the July light, the skin around my wrist is already somewhat paler than the rest of me, though, like the planets and the summer sun, nothing is permanent. It is 10 in the morning. The main road through Boer periodically billows with dust as a breeze blows through town. The men stare at me and then look away. Someone spits in the dirt. Hidden in the folds of my robe, there is a bag filled with more tukruk than they can earn in 6 months or even a year if the winter is harsh. Normally, they would be out on the grasslands, out watching their flocks or herding them in for one of the 2 daily milkings, but today they drive the many kilometers into Boer on their motorbikes to bring their wives in to do the shopping. The men huddle idly around the table as men often do as they wait for women. Men with time on their hands, looking to establish their status among their kind. I step out of the post office and their faces fall. I am not what they want. I am a novice of the Yatu Jingle Monastery, a monk who lives in the shadow of the sleeping volcano. As it is mid-morning, the mail truck I am to ride to Ulaanbaatar on the first stage of my journey is not scheduled to arrive for hours. 2,500 years ago, Gautama Buddha says, you only lose that which you cling to. Silently, I approach the pool table and nod. Brother, booms the one enthroned in the camping chair. He is sitting with his legs spread wide, a toothpick in his fingers as he works at his teeth. Something in the lackadaisical arrangement of his limbs reminds me of Mun. Mun's long black hair often loose like a horse's mane. I only play for money, the man says. A good policy, I say. I lay 2,000 tukruk on the table. 10 minutes later, and I can tell the others do not know who to root for. The one who sits outside the post office each day looking to deprive the local herdsmen of their money, or me, a young monk from Yatu Gol in his simple red robe. My body wavers like a flame in the summer heat. On the faded table, the balls roll and crack like stars. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thanks to the Virginia Humanities, the festival, Kevin, and Aaron, and all the others. I'm going to start with a poem from a book called According to Sand. It's called Little Reed Creek, a short poem. Started in plein air along Little Reed Creek, which flows down the east side of a mountain in Bedford County. Apple Orchard Mountain area, and it goes like this. Here's about to the prep work, sap rise and seep drip. Here is all there isn't to know. Schisms in the soil sphere, toothwort, violet, cleaver. Early April, poplar's green shiver, visibility for glades. This ridge, Terrapin Mountain, that one, white oak knob. No more else yet, many ferns still curled. Plunge pools in pocket water, trillium there, and there, trillium. Don't call it work, what the boulders do, but what they don't do. The rest. The punch bowls, the hollows in every hollow. Here is lair, and the water thrush at evening piping up at morning too. Still a little bite in the air, still a little gobbler scratch and root. The duff, a treatise on parchment, weather's imprint, notes on the future, the last next generation all at once. Buck rub and split trunk, a tick in your flank steak, deadfall, more deadfall, if zest, if spritz. Let it go on, the hellebore, the black birch's shelf life, polypore and parasitic burls, anemone. I read that in part because it segues into this middle grade novel that our main character is 9-year-old Lucinda May Coggins. It's 1979. The school begins on the last day of school before winter break. And on that final day of school, Lucinda and her pal, Jean, who both live in this little hollow, kind of where the present day Gorges State Park is in upstate South Carolina, have been giggling and goofing around on the bus ride to school and talking about this old man Speed, who lives up in their hollow, and they never really see him, and he lives in this rundown little cabin, and they've always wanted to know what's going on in that cabin. They've decided to spy on him, maybe break in, at least poke in the windows and check it out. And but at the show and tell, Lucinda May brings this photo that she got from her grandma, Mimi. She calls Mimi. And it's a picture of, from years back, her great uncle had brought a camera back from the war, World War II. And on account of the war, I'd spent a lot of time just poking around the mountains, taking pictures of stuff. And there had been a really warm Christmas Eve, really warm. And Lucinda May's uncle had encountered a one-eyed woman in a red dress who had a carriage landed on top of Painter Mountain, which was the big mountain kind of that forms this hollow down below. And she was unhitching her reindeer and hitching instead to this carriage a brook trout, a fox, and other local animals more suited to the climate to pull the carriage. And she tells this story at the show and tell and gets a lot of grief for it being kind of far-fetched. This is basically a tall tale. But her teacher, Lucinda May, her teacher, Miss Cartmel, is from the city. Wears 1979 flare-leg pantsuits, etc., and big glasses. Is always calling Lucinda May saucy. And Lucinda May doesn't know what to make of being called saucy. Is too scared of her teacher to ask what that means. And so she's perplexed. She's also worried about her teacher because her teacher seems ill and tired. And she has a fascination and deep respect for her teacher, even though she's kind of persona non grata in the community at this time. So I'm going to read a little bit where Lucinda May and Jean have are poking around Old Man Speed's house. They found that the interior is a little different than they expected. They'd been joking on the bus that there was a hole in the floor, and then he had a fire, and just cooked over a fire under the hole in the floor. But, here's the moment on page 40. Lucinda May and Jean. Jean's 10, Lucinda May's 9. They were back in the house. Lucinda May moved with haste. Her mother's warning about Mr. Speed was fresh in her mind. She went directly to the oversized sketchbook and knelt and started to flip through the pages again. Nothing of particular interest caught her eye. Jean had been standing behind her, but now tiptoed around the corner into the kitchen. "Cinda, here, quick," she said. "What?" "Look here." Lucinda May stood. The air in the house felt funny for a moment, and she tried to ignore it. She went around to the kitchen. "The knives are gone." "So?" Lucinda May said. "It means he could be home," Jean said. Her voice sounded weak. "He's not home," Lucinda May said. "Who says I'm not home?" The voice was that of a man. It came from the front room. It might as well have been a gunshot. Lucinda May heard the door shut, and then footsteps, and then it could only be the tap of a cane. She stood straighter as Jean grabbed her hand. She looked at the fireplace like it might tell her what to say. "Hello," Jean said in a voice both sweeter and more mature somehow than Lucinda May had ever heard from her friend. The tone of it sent sparks through her bones, and she could not remember how to breathe. "Well, I'll be," said the man. It was, no doubt about it, Old Man Speed, tall, dark-haired, gaunt, slightly stooped, but strong. the lines on his face reminding Lucinda May of the hatchet marks in the stump out back. A pointy tuft of white hair grew from his chin while the rest of his face was clean shaven. He wore a leather hat with 3 guinea fowl feathers on the right side of the band. His jacket was made of some other skin, and in Lucinda's mind, it might as well have been the skin of the last person who had trespassed in his house. That dress is the exact color of a trout lily blossom, Mr. Speed said. Lucinda May only wears yellow dresses. Every day, different yellow dresses of different 70s fabrics, and has big red hair. His voice was gravelly but gentle, and for some reason Lucinda May wanted to trust it. Lucinda May looked down. She was wearing her yellow corduroy dress with yellow leggings beneath. It was a long dress to her calves. And you, he continued. Lucinda May watched as the man looked at Jean now. He didn't look mad at all, just looked surprised, maybe even pleasantly so. You have the hair of a raven, noble. Before they knew what to say, he went on, but it's wrong of you to be in my house without permission. To what do I owe this breach of trust? The sound of the birds in the elm dripped into the room through the chimney or through the ceiling or walls. It was hard for Lucinda May to tell. She was studying the lines on Mr. Speed's cheeks. His whole face felt to her like looking at a map. Sir, Lucinda May spoke finally, a breach of trust is owed by us. We're sorry, we'd heard you lived in very strange ways in this house and we had to see for ourselves. No, he cut her off. You don't owe a breach of trust. You apologize for a breach of trust. You're the postmaster's oldest, and you're the youngest of the Underwoods. Softly, he tapped his cane a few times. So you know about right and wrong. You know about apology. I'm sorry, Jean said first. Yes, sir, Lucinda May added. We're sorry. Mr. Speed smiled at them. Lucinda May felt herself smiling back at the man. She wondered how similar in age he was to her Mimi. I hope you've accomplished your purpose. You can see that I live simply. Mr. Speed paused again, staring at the fireplace. Would one of you please fetch some firewood from the back landing? I'm going to skip ahead read just a bit more. So, just a couple pages later, and that's the story on YouTube, I gather, Mr. Speed said. Laurel Fork students of Miss Cartman. Yes, sir, Lucinda May said. Jean nodded in agreement. Behind her bangs, the girl looked more comfortable now. Lucinda May felt relieved to see this. She caught her friend's eye for a moment. In that glance, she could tell that Jean wasn't disappointed at all in how their day had turned, that she was even enjoying her role of wood gatherer. Already she learned, as had Lucinda May, how to tell the difference between locust, hickory, and poplar, the poplar being good for a fast hot burner, the locust and hickory better for, as Mr. Speed put it, the long haul. I gather you all find Miss Cartman a bit strange, Speed said. The rest of Laurel Fork sure does. She's a city lady, Lucinda May said quickly. She's always calling Cinda saucy, Jean added. I think we make her nervous, Lucinda May said. A rooster crowed in the distance. There was barking, the baying of hounds. It was bear season. The hunters were running their dogs. Miss Cartman is city folk, Mr. Speed said, and she makes a lot of folks in Laurel Fork nervous with her ideas, her ways of teaching, the fact that she isn't married. But there are Cartman people in these hills, and she comes from them. Her grandfather does. After the war, he moved to Columbia to attend the university, and then he found work, good paying work at a bank in Greenville after he finished at the university there. He paused and sipped from a mug of black coffee. Lucinda May nearly giggled loud when she saw Jean eyeing it. Jean loves to drink coffee. And then he continued, matter of fact, I was out this morning doing some work for Miss Cartman. You might think she's here like some of the other teachers you've had, the ones who sign up to work in remote places that some call depressed, disadvantaged. And she is, but she's here to teach for other reasons too. She's got ambitions, good ones. And I'll hold off there. The story goes that in order to potentially help Miss Cartman, Mr. Speed, who's in that sketchbook and in that house of his, has lots of natural remedies, things from the hills, thinks that a tea brewed of a shed reindeer antler from the years before when the one-eyed potential Santa lady left her reindeer for a while in a corral. So they go, without anyone's permission, looking for reindeer antler.
I wish I were wearing yellow though, that something. Anyway, I I thought I'd also primarily read from the novel, but I've been thinking a lot about, I'm often saying that the opposite of poetry isn't prose. Right? There's in my favorite novels and short stories and so forth, there's plenty of poetry, rich language and so forth. And I started to think about my poems and why, for some reason, I was unable to take some of the material that I wanted to write about in this novel and do that in the kinds of poems that I write. There is most of my poems for the last 10 years or so have been sonnet haunted, so they're either 14 lines or in that zone. And Terence Hayes calls the sonnet a combination of a meat grinder and a music box. And I really love that, and I love the compression of that, and I like the challenge of that and the satisfaction of that, that I can work on a lyric poem and feel like I've done something. And for the stories that I wanted to tell in Paradise Close, which is comprised of 3 parts, in the first two sections have different characters, but they rhyme in a little way. So in the first part, the main characters are an adolescent girl, 14-year-old, named Marlies, who has anorexia and is hospitalized in a progressive psychiatric institute where she meets an older patient, a slightly older boy who's just shy of 21, and he's a painter, kind of a boy genius in a kind of way. But she's an orphan, and her trust fund runs out. You can see that I read a lot of Bronte tickets. And so she ends up in this isolated house across the Delaware in New Jersey, an old family place called Paradise Close. And then in part 2, we have a middle-aged love affair between a woman named Emma and a young poet named Trey. The young, I say, in their 40s. And it's misbegotten. It ends, and Trey takes himself off to an old family place in the Shenandoah Valley and pines away as a sort of isolado until, unbeknownst to him, a woman who's tried to kill herself by crashing her car into a mountain on a logging road fails to do so and has amnesia as a result of the accident and makes her way into the house of Trey, and he doesn't know that she's there. And so there's that. And then for me, as you can see, already that's too much for the 14 lines, And then in the third part, I kind of bring these characters that kind of rhyme together, and I started thinking, what do I do in my poems that I don't do in my prose? And I think a lot of it, I drew a little Venn diagram, and I think that a lot of the things that interest me, like shifts in diction, tonal registers, rhyming is sexy. I do a lot of it in my poems, but in here, the characters rhyme. And a friend of mine who read Paradise Close, a friend from Boston, wrote and said, it's really just like one of your poems, but it has people in it. So I think that what I thought I would do is just read 2 short sections, each of which kind of represents something that I do in my poems. The strikes a kind of tone that happens in my poems, but I just had more duration in the novel, and that's what I appreciated about it. More space, more time to develop and have these characters in counterpoint. So this is a section from part 2. So in this, it's called The Glass Room, 2016. And this is when Trey Handel, who's pining for this long-lost love artist that he was in love with, is living alone in this big old house. And unbeknownst to him, someone is squatting there in a kind of nursery, in an upstairs nursery with a glass solarium. The Glass Room, 2016. Whatever dark river or lightning strike or bad choice or accident made and undid her, whether or not she was the author of her own tale, whether it was a story terrifying, melancholy, dull, or full of delight, danger, abuse, and of losses few or innumerable, the woman who had crawled out of Orphan Mountain and unbeknownst to Trey Handel's house did not belong to those forces now. She was secreted in another kind of story, high as a tower, where through the roof of a glass room she watched the clock of the world pass over her. Tart, persimmon yellow equinoctial sun, unbuttoned blouses of cloud, cerulean byways, star clots, the constellations in their leg irons, the moon in its guises, mysterious silks of the galaxies. And she moved, sometimes without clothing, through the urns of light and passages of darkness, and slept in a bed with rails like a baby or a crone, and fed a scratch of cracker meal to birds who visited at a wide sill of one of the leaded windows that she could crank open. Below her, the woods burned, a piazza and fountain, and beyond that, leaf flames girdling a black pond, scoured by regal swaths of the geese who fell to their own reflections, then lifted off again with strange, concussive, mournful bellows, departing in V's that reflected those they left in their wake as they swam across the dark water. Sometimes the man with the gray ponytail, reddish in the sun, and black glasses walked among them, shouldering an axe. Up here, safe, her wounds slowly healed in warm, rank baths she drew and emerged from, silver hair untangling in lengthening rivulets down her shoulders back. She felt like someone very old who has outlived everyone she might have harmed, or who might have harmed or loved her, anyone she might have loved. When she saw herself in a window, a mirror, dark eyes, filmy hair, loose belly, starry swoop of breasts, she opened her mouth in a cloud of mist against the glass as though to make a word or name. Occasionally, a mouse scampered quick along the moldings, a clubhouse smell, fecal pellets in the drawers among beeswax candlesticks. On cold nights, she wore the robe, burned with matches from a drawer, old chair rails, papers, boxes, in the sooty maw of the fireplace. She ate all the old food left over in the cupboards, thought about the man below and whether he would ever enter this room or if she would ever leave it. Gotta get a drink of water. So that's, I think, represents a kind of lyric voice that I often deploy in my poems. There's a lot of talk about what the lyric is, but it's certainly something that one can use in novels as well. This second short section that I want to read is from part 1. So this is the part where there's the adolescent pair. This takes place before Marlies is banished to this family home, Paradise Cross, across the river. She's still in the institute, the hospital, and so is Silas, her friend. It's Thanksgiving. Her guardian, her parents are dead. Her guardian lives in Bucks County, which is north of Philadelphia, where the hospital is located. And it's Thanksgiving, and the patients are allowed to leave. They're allowed to take a little vacation. And Silas's folks live in Europe, and he's pretty estranged from them. And so Marlies asks her guardian, Maurice. And I think, Andy, you asked me this question at an earlier reading, but one of my daughters said, okay, there's Marlies and Maurice and Silas. Really, they all want to be Lisa, right? But right, Maurice agrees to let Silas come home with Marlies for the vacation. And I think there's one little person who may be in the hallway with his mother. There's a little profanity in this section of the website. It's just a trigger. Marlies still hid and threw away food, but she seemed well enough to Dr. Lance by Thanksgiving, up to nearly 90 pounds, to make the trip to Bucks County for the long holiday weekend. Since Silas had no place to go, his parents were living abroad somewhere, Montreux, he thought, or perhaps visiting his sister, the gallery manager in Paris, Marlies had convinced Maurice to consent to Silas's coming along for the holiday. Once one more, Maurice had said, but Marlies heard the fatigue and smoke in his voice as it crackled through the receiver of the ward's hallway payphone. It had been a bad idea. By Friday night, Silas had discovered and smoked an entire dime bag belonging to the son of Maurice's current wife, Sylvie, and was later caught with his hand on the shirt of one of her daughters in the master bedroom linen closet. But hearing about this pained Marlies. What was Silas to her? Brother, caretaker, antic force? Who or what was she to him? But before Maurice had driven them both back to the Institute on Saturday, earlier than planned, there had been that bitingly cold Thanksgiving Day afternoon when Sylvie, on her last legs with Maurice, and who apparently had some kind of guru back in London, had gone up to a rocky field behind the house to spray paint a labyrinth into the dun grasses. First, she tied red ribbons in various trees and shrubs to symbolize her unmet spiritual wishes and future desires. But while she was mapping out her labyrinth, following directions from a sheet of paper and pointing a can of rust-red spray paint at the ground, pacing out her steps, a herd of cows that had busted loose from a neighboring farm had circled her. Their breath chuffed in the air, their scrutiny sullen. Terrified, she began to call for help. By the time Maurice, Silas, Marlies, and some stepchildren and neighbors had gathered at the hilltop, Sylvie was in a heap, sobbing on the ground. A few yards off, a calf chewed placidly on one of the red ribbons as the rest of the herd mulled about in steam, mud, and piss. Look, Maurice, Sylvia spat out, syllable by syllable, her fit of weeping arrested by the embarrassed stares of the onlookers. At least the fucking labyrinth is completely clear. At least the bitches didn't shit in the labyrinth. Shit in the labyrinth became Marlies and Silas's code phrase after that. Most of the formulations were his idea. Formation of the United States Environmental Protection Agency as Oyster Creek Nuclear Facility opened 40 miles from Philadelphia. Shit in the labyrinth. Someone taping out-of-order signs on all the payphones during the Institute Christmas party. Silas pretended to make several loud and querulous overseas calls to his parents just to show he wasn't fooled. Shit. Philly Police Commissioner Rizzo raids the Black Panther offices and strips their black asses in the street. Shit in the labyrinth. Silas, beautiful Silas, small and compact but full of lips with long lustrous hair. Silas of the breathtaking hairless chest. Silas of the racing mind, heading for the basement shock rooms? Shit. Marlies, unformed, sprung into a parentless, impoverished, unsupervised limo while still in the helpless throes of self-starvation. Shit. Shit in the effing labyrinth. Maybe I'll ask one question, and then we can open the bit up to the floor. It's about 15 minutes left. So I guess maybe one thing that we have a common denominator, or one question I would have, going back to the idea that maybe poetry and prose are not opposites, is just to talk about ways in which the praxis of making poems has affected all of the writing you do, whether it's fiction, poetry, essays, letters of recommendation, doing a lot of that lately. I don't know if anybody wants to take that one on.
Yeah, so as many people may know, I began my career as a poet. My training, my MFA from Michigan is in poetry. And so the first 4 books that I published were poetry books, and then I began writing fiction, and then I began doing plays. So for me, in many ways, actually, there are definite ways in which I see that poetry has informed my fiction and also my playwriting. And the biggest way, there's 2 things. One has to do with timing. So timing is everything. And there's a small part of me that, my second novel that I wrote is actually comedic. And again, I think one of the reasons why I was able to do it was because I'm a poet. And so it's like you tell a joke, if you tell it too long, if it goes on a beat too long, it doesn't work, right? And the same thing happens in fiction. So like the difference between using the word a trash can versus a waste paper basket, so it's all about, again, timing. You have to make it short and tight. And so that's one way in which poetry has definitely helped me in the other genres that I work in. And then the second way that poetry has actually helped me has nothing to do with the actual writing of it, but it has to do with the business of it. So I don't know, I think there might be some MFAs here in the audience, but I always sort of have the joke, but it's actually true for me, is that I'm glad I started my career as a poet, because in some ways nobody really, I don't want to say that nobody cares about poets, so it's not like that, but it really lowered the threshold of what I consider to be like success in a good way. And I don't mean that it sounds kind of negative, but it's for me now that everything that's happened for me with respect to fiction or that's happened in playwriting, it's all gravy. Like I never thought any of that kind of stuff would happen, right? And so I do think there's ways in which a lot of young writers come to writing, come to literature, and they're thinking, my first book's gonna come out, it's gonna change the world, it'll be a series on Netflix, all these things. And I think because I started as a poet, I didn't have those expectations, and so it allows me just to have fun. And so I think that poetry is all about just having fun and creating. So, yeah.
I'll just say one thing. I think the practice of learning and reading and imitating poets from a young age taking things through many hundreds of drafts, just helped me with, as I branched into other genres, nonfiction, fiction, fable. This middle grade novel grew from stories I was writing for my oldest child, now 25, as Christmas gifts. When she was young, I would write her, I was reading lots of books to her at night, and Jean Craig had George's books, were a big hit with her, and I really enjoyed reading those, and her influences in this, and so the ways that I became comfortable with imitating and trying to learn from other writers by trying out their moves came into play with this book. Yeah.
And something else both I think related to time is that I've talked about this before with some of my students who are here, but I think one reason my poems became shorter for a long time was I had 3 children, ages 3 and under, and I had a full-time job, and so a lot of times, writing was, and I've said this before, driving around Charlottesville until they all fell asleep in their car seats, and then, trying to write in the car or behind the bathroom door or something. And so I think that therefore I used to have these big, elaborate, beautiful journals that, now I use just the small moleskin because it was easier to carry around and the poems became smaller. For that reason, I think that's part of it. And then when my children were older, the house there was more time for me, although I'm always surprised when I have friends who have young children and really, really demanding jobs, and they still write these incredible novels and one after the next. But yeah, I don't want to. I wondered, anything else? Would you all have a question for us, or should we just find out? Yeah.
I have a question for you all, because you all began as poets, and I'd like to know what you each think is the most important thing to remember of a poet when you're writing prose.
For me, I gotta tone it down a little bit, not too crazy with lyricism and imagery, and remember there's some connective tissue, and you have to keep the readers informed and on solid ground with the narrative.
Got 2 mics, so excuse me. For me, the biggest thing is compression, right? It's tightness of language. It's getting it done as fast as possible. And that's not because, we live in a world in which obviously people's attention spans are so short in many ways, so that's not the reason why, but I think it just makes for better writing. If you can get it done in 5 words instead of 6, get it done in 5. So with my students, I always think also in terms of the syllable. Like you're using 12 syllables here. Can you get it done in 10, right? And I really think that you can tell the difference between writing that's really tight like that and writing that isn't. And then the last thing I'll say is one of the best pieces of advice I ever received as an undergrad was to not be afraid to create the image you can't rationally explain, right? And so I forget that though in my fiction and in my playwriting, and I think I need to remember it more in my playwriting. Right now, the kind of plays that I'm writing are I kind of laughingly describe them as very like Arthur Miller, like very highly structured, like, whereas a lot of people working in playwriting now, the play has really come loose from like narrative structure, And I'm like, wait, I'm a poet. I should be able to write a play that's not so tightly narrative. So that's something that I should probably remember more.
One thing that I've had to think about too is, I don't think I've had this conversation with you, Deborah, but when I'm in my poems, maybe it's because as Quan said, you feel like nobody's really reading them, that I feel like I have a veil, a Dickinsonian kind of veil that if there is a first person, it's not me, it's just someone else. And I always wonder, like, why with books of poems we don't say, any likeness to characters living or real, but we do that in fiction, and so I've had to free myself from the worry that somebody in my fiction might feel too close to me, or it would just stop me from writing, and I just forged through. Makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, Kevin.
Lisa, you spoke a little to duration and the short amount of time you have, the poems. And I feel like the poems you can even with your revising Thorpe said, time after time, you can come back to them and get to the beginning and the end and think through your revision in a shorter amount of time. How did you deal with the longer stretches of time that you needed? Is it did it move into weeks, or did you need a month, or how did time expand maybe in the longer genres for you, and the needs on you as a person to find that time?
Me? Oh yeah.
All three of you.
No, what I would say is that this book is long in the making. I started thinking about it in, I would say, almost 20 years ago. And it started off with this idea, like writing a short story about a woman who tried to kill herself on a back logging road and doesn't succeed, but has amnesia and doesn't remember that she wanted to kill herself. And I found that really compelling and problematic, like somewhere in her psyche that impulse still existed, but what happened to it? And was that a gift, like a second chance? And that was long ago when I was living in Texas and couldn't write poems and was trying to write short stories. And that just sort of stayed with me for a while, and then I started working on what's now part 2 of the book, which is the lovers in Virginia and so forth. And then later, when I had my own girls, I began to think more about my own adolescence and things I wanted to write about, that hospitalization and so forth. And so I had these things going, and they were separate. I thought, and then at some point, about 5 years ago, I guess I realized that they were together. So I've had there's been a long gestation for this one. I think other people who are more experienced it doesn't take that long. But I've had people say, I can't wait to read your next one. And I'm like, may not be alive. But I am actually working on something else that I nearly finished with on a sabbatical right now. So anyway, others?
This one was very long in the making. The first chapter was in the prior version, the gift for my oldest. I forget what Christmas that was, but she's 25 now, and she was probably 9 or 10. I don't teach in January because there's a J term in Hollands, and these characters and the sort of myth of the female Santa and the reindeer and these other things that come in, there's magic, fantasy kind of things. They wouldn't leave me alone, and I just kept going through January and got a draft through to a finish. I was working on other things. I put it away to work on other books, poetry books, nonfiction. Picked it up some years later, worked on it, found an agent for it. She helped me hone it a bit. It didn't sell. Put it away again, worked on it again some years later, found this press. They gave me a great editor. Rose Alexandra Leach was incredibly helpful, especially with the nuances of the friendship between Lucinda May and Jean. And so it's been a long sort of put it away for a couple of years, pick it up when I'm in the mood, usually around Christmas, to play with magic and think about a different sentiment.
Yeah, with my very first novel, She Weeps Each Time You're Born, I had a novel idea that had the same exact title, and I worked on that novel for probably 2 years, and probably wrote a couple hundred pages, and then I had to throw it away. It was terrible. And so, but to think about time, it is true that for fiction, it's about butts in seats. You got to sit there for a long time, right? And so, for example, when you go to an artist colony, it's true that oftentimes the poets are not the most popular people there. So, for example, the poem that I read called Auction, when I was in an artist colony called Yaddo, and I wrote one of my favorite poems ever in 20 minutes, and I spent the rest of the day at the pool, and then like the other artists were like, so what did you do today? And I'm like, I wrote my best poem ever! And then I spent the rest of the day at the pool, So there is a way that, the joke is always that poets are thinking for 23 and a half hours a day and then write for half an hour, and then, and then fiction writers are doing the opposite of that. The thing that I will say though, the thing that I would say about, as a helpful thing, so something I'm always talking about with my students, it sounds a little new agey. I don't mean it in a new agey way, and there's a way in which I think Marie Kondo has ruined the word joy, but it is true that the first novel, there was a way in which I was struggling, the one that I threw away. I struggled, I was struggling, I kept struggling, the habitual struggle, but whatever that verb is, the habitual, I struggled for a long time with that. And after a while, I find, it's almost like with the body. You know, when you have pain and you don't listen to it, like it's good, it's there, it's telling you something. It's telling you you shouldn't be doing something, right? This is for me, I do believe in this idea of ease and joy, right? Is that when I'm supposed to be working on it, there's a certain kind of ease, a certain kind of joy. When you work on a long novel, you're not gonna have joy for 3 years every day. Like, woohoo, why not? Like, I'm working on a novel right now, and there's times when it's definitely not joyous, right? But I also recognize, and again, I was talking to one of my graduate students recently about this, like, you do have to learn to recognize when it's just the everyday struggle of trying to like put in the hours and have your butt in the seat, and when it's something else, when it's really the project telling you there is something else you should be doing right now, right? So it just takes, you just have to listen to that. But I really do believe in this idea of ease. And finally, I'll tell my students that, you know, when something is easy, and I don't mean easy as in the sense that you could just dial it in and do it in your eyes closed. Like, that's not the kind of ease I'm talking about. I'm talking about a different kind of ease. And when that ease happens, I tell my students, like, you have to ride that, because you do not know how long that's gonna last. And so it's true, like with my second book, We Write Upon Sticks, it's basically, it's like my girls' field hockey team, high school. I wrote that, that book was easy and it was fun, and I just wrote it as far as, like, you know, I just wrote that energy. And so, yeah.
Another few minutes, if anybody else has another question.
I the professor, he's like, I thought I saw a question.
It did seem, I wasn't sure if we still had time. But, so my question is about your personal relationship to genre and how you feel about it on a spectrum going from, like, you know what, it's all just writing, and genre is this, whether it's poetry, prose, drama, like it's kind of a box that is restrictive, to the other side of the spectrum where it's like, the differences are really important, and there are things that we get from having different genres, and so it's important not to say, oh, it's all just writing. That's why I wasn't going to ask it, because it's kind of weird, but I would love to hear what you think.
I was going to say, you know, it's true, because as a child, I didn't make those distinctions. I just wrote, right? So my mom kept everything, and she sent it to me recently, and it's, you know, there's like novels, unfinished novels, and poems, and, you know, because again, I didn't know the difference between those things. So for me, just on a practical level, it's not helpful to think in terms of that, like, because it's also true that, for example, I've never studied playwriting, and I've never studied fiction, even though I teach it. But I've never studied it, and because I don't know the rules, it means I feel like I can kind of do what I want, you know? And I think that's the same thing. So when you start to use genre, and when it starts to stop you from doing things. But conversely, the converse can happen too, that sometimes you can bring a different genre into what you're doing in a different area, and then, you know, use the conventions of that genre in this other thing. So sometimes it can be helpful, right? So I'm always just about, I'm very practical. I'm like, how can it help me? And I don't want to have things that are constraints and that hold me back, so.
It seems like genre is really important for the marketplace to me.
Yeah.
Booksellers, libraries, etc. Working in Holland's, teaching there, it's all multi-genre, so any particular workshop I could be reading and thinking and trying to help students with all genres, hybrids, and in order to do that well, I felt like I was always messing around with other genres, but it helped me and inspired me. My students inspired me with their genre shifting and various genres.
I mean, I would agree with that. I would agree with what both said. I mean, I brought up this book with my beloved Percy Books, and they are my poetry publishers too. And what I valued about doing the book with them was that they let me write the book I wanted to write, and they were trying to figure out where it was going to be placed on the Barnes & Noble, you know, shoved into what category. And so, you know, love is love, and I have to say that that's sort of how I feel about writing too. Maybe we should wrap up because it's 3 o'clock. Thank you so much for being here today and for this conversation.